August 12, 1945. Algona, Iowa. The air was thick, not with coal smoke or the metallic tang of cordite, but with something heavy and sweet. Green. Alona thought of it as a color with a smell that coated the back of her throat. She stepped down from the truck, her boots sinking slightly into the soft black dirt at the roadside. The ground itself felt different, spongy, alive. For a year, the earth beneath her feet had been either frozen or rubble. This was something else, a dark, rich blanket of a world. She and 20 other women stood in a loose, silent cluster, their gray uniforms already dark with sweat under the high, white sun. No one spoke. They watched the man in faded overalls who gestured with his chin toward a long, low wooden building. His words were a soft, rumbling noise, meaningless as the buzzing of the insects that filled the air. Alona's eyes scanned the perimeter. A wire fence, yes, but not a tall one. No guard towers. No dogs. Just the fence, and beyond it, a sea of green stalks, taller than a man, marching in perfect, terrifying rows to the horizon. It was a silent, disciplined army of plants. A silence that was louder than the artillery she still heard in her sleep. Zofia, who had grown up on a farm near Debrecen, nudged her. She pointed, not with her finger, a habit long beaten out of them, but with a slight tilt of her head. Alona followed her gaze. At the far end of the field, a machine was moving. It was bright red, a color so vivid it hurt her eyes. It moved with a confident, steady roar, much louder than the German half-tracks, but somehow less threatening. And it was fast, impossibly fast. It churned the black earth in its wake, leaving a perfect, dark ribbon behind it. Alona's mind struggled to find a category for it. It was bigger than a car, louder than a truck. It moved with the mechanical purpose of a tank, but its speed was wrong. Panzer IVs, their steel tracks clattering on cobblestones, had been slower than this. This red beast was pulling a complex metal contraption that sliced into the soil. She watched it reach the end of a row, execute a tight, efficient turn, and begin a new line without pause. The man driving it sat casually, one arm resting on the huge rear wheel, his head turning to watch his work. A farmer, driving a red machine faster than a tank. A machine for digging in the earth, not to make a trench for hiding, but to put things in, to grow things. The sheer, peaceful violence of it was overwhelming. A soft, incomprehensible dread began to form in Alona's stomach. This place was not what they had been told. Not all. This place was one of nearly 150 base camps and 500 branch camps scattered across the United States. A vast, invisible network designed to solve a problem of abundance. While Europe starved, America's farms were producing too much for too few hands to harvest. The draft had pulled millions of men from the fields, and the nation that was feeding its own civilians, its own massive army, and much of the Allied world was facing a critical labor shortage. The solution was an act of cold, brilliant pragmatism: prisoners of war. Over 400,000 German, Italian, and Austrian soldiers were shipped to the United States between 1942 and 1945. They were housed, fed, and put to work in fields and factories, their labor filling the gap left by the men sent to fight them. But the women who arrived in Iowa were an anomaly. They were not soldiers. Most were Hungarian nurses, administrative staff, factory workers, and auxiliaries attached to German or Hungarian army units overrun by the Soviets in the final, chaotic months of the war. Fleeing west, they had surrendered to the Americans, who had no clear protocol for what to do with them. They were a logistical footnote, swept across the Atlantic in the belly of a returning troop transport, their existence a bureaucratic puzzle. For Alona, the journey had been a disorienting blur of anonymous authority. Men in different uniforms asking the same questions in a language she couldn't parse. Medical inspections where a doctor's gentle touch felt more alarming than a guard's shove. They were given new clothes, plain but clean cotton dresses and sturdy shoes, and food that shocked them into silence. White bread, real butter, milk. On the train ride across the country, she had watched the landscape change from the dense green of the east to the vast, open geometry of the Midwest. She saw no ruins, Norofuyikalims. No children with the old, hollowed-out eyes she was used to. Instead, she saw houses, each one sitting on its own neat patch of lawn. She saw cars moving on paved roads. She saw laundry hanging on lines, bright squares of color flapping in the wind. Each ordinary sight was a small, sharp shock. It was a country that didn't look like it was at war. It looked like it was at peace, a deep, unshakable peace that was simply lending its sons and its factories to a conflict happening somewhere else, on another planet. The camp in Algona was not a place of punishment, but of production. Their bodies were not there to be broken, but to be used. They were a resource, like fertilizer or gasoline, to be applied to the land to maximize its yield. The material stakes were brutally simple. For the Americans, it was profit and produce. For the Hungarian women, it was survival, measured in calories and the slow passing of days until a future they could not imagine. The contrast defined their existence. It was a daily, lived comparison that slowly unwound their understanding of the world. First, the food. In the last year, a meal in Budapest had been a cup of thin soup with a few gritty potato peels floating in it, eaten in a damp cellar while the city shook from Russian shelling. Here, breakfast was 2 eggs, fried, with bacon and a thick slice of bread. Zofia, the farm girl, stared at her first plate for a full minute, her fork hovering. She had seen pigs in Hungary, but they were thin, feral things. The bacon on her plate was thick with fat, a sign of such obscene surplus it felt like a provocation. She ate it slowly, methodically, her mind cataloging the caloric wealth. She estimated that a single American breakfast contained more energy than her entire family had consumed in a day. The contrast was in the soil. The earth Zofia had last worked was tired, overworked for centuries, its nutrients leached. Here, the Iowa topsoil was black and heavy, a foot deep. She'd pick up a handful and let it run through her fingers. It felt greasy, alive. It smelled of future growth, a scent so potent it was almost dizzying. It was a land that had never known true exhaustion. Then there was the machinery. At home, a farm's most valuable asset was a good horse. A tractor was a legend, something a wealthy landowner might own, a rare and precious beast. Here, every farm had one, often 2. Ilona would watch them from the fields where she and the other women were assigned to detassel corn, a tedious, manual job that felt primitive in the shadow of so much mechanization. The American farmers, men too old or too young for the draft, drove their machines with a casual ease, their movements economical and sure. The women saw John Deere green and Farmel red everywhere. The names were stamped on the metal, and Ilona would sound them out in her head, strange, powerful syllables. They compared these machines not to farm equipment they knew, but to the military hardware that had flattened their world. A combine harvester, a monstrously complex machine that cut, threshed, and cleaned grain in a single pass, was larger than a Stu-G assault gun. It made more noise, and its purpose was the polar opposite of the tanks. One was designed for the efficient creation of food, the other for the efficient creation of death. The women worked 12-hour days under that relentless sun, their own physical labor a stark contrast to the effortless power of the engines roaring around them. They were living in a new reality, one governed by a logic of production so powerful it felt like a force of nature. The women learned to read this new world through the lives of the people who inhabited it. Their primary text was the farmer's wife, a woman named Eleanor, whose husband, Frank, had contracted for their labor. Eleanor was in her 40s, with strong, capable hands and a face browned by the sun. She did not supervise them with a rifle, but with a jug of cold water and a quiet efficiency that unnerved them. She worked alongside them sometimes, her movements swift and practiced, but there was a difference. Ilona noticed it in the way Eleanor moved, a lack of tension in her shoulders, an absence of the coiled, watchful energy that every woman in Hungary carried. Eleanor did not flinch when a truck backfired on the road. Her eyes did not constantly scan the sky. She seemed to occupy her own body with a sense of security so profound it was alien. Anna, a quiet girl who had been a seamstress, was once asked by Eleanor to help mend a torn dress. Eleanor led her into the house, into a bedroom. Anna stopped in the doorway. Inside was a closet. The door was open, and inside, hanging in a neat row, were at least 10 dresses. Cotton, silks, wools. Anna could only stare. The idea of one woman owning so many clothes, of having a choice of what to wear each day, was a fantasy. She reached out and touched the sleeve of a blue-flowered cotton dress. The fabric was soft, unbroken. She remembered her own sister trading her wedding ring for a sack of flour and 2 worn-out sweaters. Eleanor, seeing her look, simply smiled, a gesture of oblivious generosity that Anna found harder to bear than a slap. Zofia watched Frank. He was a creature of his machines. He moved from tractor to truck to combine with an innate understanding of their mechanics. One afternoon, a part on the cultivator broke. Frank swore quietly, then walked to the barn. Zofia, who could fix anything with a bit of wire and ingenuity, watched, expecting him to begin a long, frustrating repair. Instead, he emerged from the barn with a brand-new part in a cardboard box. He replaced the broken piece in 10 minutes, tossed the old one onto a scrap heap, and the machine roared back to life. Zofia felt a pang of something she couldn't name. It was a form of obsolescence. Her own hard-won skills, the desperate cleverness born of scarcity, were meaningless here. Why learn to patch and mend when you could simply replace? Why save a bent nail when boxes of new ones were cheap and plentiful? She saw Eleanor in the farm's kitchen, through an open window. She was canning green beans, a mountain of them on the table. The jars, hundreds of them, lined the shelves of the pantry. It wasn't hoarding. It was just planning, an assumption of future abundance. The women's interiority became a constant ledger of these observations. Alona counted 7 cars and 3 trucks passing on the road in a single hour. Zofia calculated the weight of the hogs in the pen. Anna noted the different kinds of soap in the washroom. They were piecing together the architecture of their captivity, not from orders or edicts, but from the overwhelming evidence of material reality. This reality was the product of a system, an architecture of production that was invisible to most Americans but became blindingly clear to the Hungarian women. It was not a system of government dictates, but a confluence of geography, technology, and culture. The foundation was the land itself, the immense, fertile basin of the American Midwest, a gift of geology and climate. On top of this foundation was a layer of infrastructure. Rural electrification had brought power to these isolated farms, running the pumps, the refrigerators, the milking machines. A network of land-grant universities and agricultural extension services. A term Alona had to look up, meaning a system for sharing knowledge, had spent decades refining crop yields, breeding stronger livestock, and teaching scientific farming methods. The farmers were not peasants, bound by tradition. They were businessmen, their fields a factory floor. They read journals, listened to radio reports on commodity prices, and invested in the latest technology. The tractor was the key. It was the machine that broke the final constraint of animal power, allowing a single family to cultivate hundreds of acres where their European counterparts could manage only a few dozen. This system created a self-reinforcing loop. Mechanization increased yields, which increased profits, which allowed for the purchase of more and better machines. The war barely interrupted this cycle. In many ways, it accelerated it. The government guaranteed prices for staple crops, removing financial risk and encouraging maximum production. The women were a direct consequence of this system. They were the temporary human patch applied to a labor gap in a machine that could not be allowed to slow down. From their perspective, observing from the ground up, the logic was undeniable. They saw the end result first. The towering grain elevators beside the railway tracks, holding more wheat than they had ever seen in their lives. They saw the cattle cars, filled with impossibly fat steers. They felt the effects in the 3 substantial meals they were given each day. Only later, through overheard conversations and the sheer repetition of the evidence, did they begin to understand the mechanism behind it all. The system was a schematic metaphor they were living inside of. It was a vast, decentralized engine designed to turn soil, sunlight, and water into material power. The food they grew might end up on a soldier's plate in the Pacific or in a care package dropped over a starving European city after the war. They were cogs, yes, but cogs in a machine so vast and productive that its sheer scale was a strategic weapon, more decisive than any single battle. Their own nation, with its brave soldiers and its desperate, clever people, had never stood a chance. It had been trying to fight an engine with its bare hands. The primary shock of the fields soon found its echo in the domestic sphere. The contrast was not just in the tools of production, but in the artifacts of daily life. When the weather turned cold, the women were issued new coats. They were simple wool blend jackets, but they were new. The fabric was coarse, but unbroken, the seams perfectly stitched by a machine. Anna, the seamstress, ran her thumb over a seam. It was flawless. She thought of the nights spent by candlelight, unraveling an old coat to restitch it for a smaller child, her fingers stiff and her eyes aching. The casual disposability of newness was a constant, low-level assault on their values. One day, a glass jar of peaches was dropped in the kitchen. It shattered on the floor. Eleanor sighed in frustration, swept up the mess of glass and fruit, and threw it away. The women who saw it froze. An entire jar of preserved fruit, a treasure of sugar and calories, discarded without a second thought. In Hungary, the women would have spent an hour picking out the shards of glass, salvaging every possible piece of fruit, licking the syrup from their fingers. To see it swept into the trash felt like a physical violation, a moral crime. This friction was not just material, it was ideological. It forced a reevaluation of everything they had been taught. Their world had been defined by scarcity. Scarcity bred a certain set of virtues: thrift, ingenuity, patience, a suspicion of waste. It was a moral universe built on the assumption that there was never enough. America presented them with the opposite. It was a world of plenty, and plenty seemed to breed its own set of virtues: efficiency, optimism, a focus on the new over the old, and a shocking level of waste. The women felt their own hard-won virtues becoming irrelevant, even contemptible. What use was Zofia's skill in making a meal from potato peels when potatoes themselves were used as hog feed? What value was Anna's talent for mending when new clothes were so cheap? They were prisoners on the losing side of a global war, yet they were healthier and better fed than they had been as free citizens. This inversion was profoundly disorienting. Who was truly rich and who was poor? Who was strong and who was weak? The propaganda they had absorbed for years had painted America as a decadent, mongrel nation, spiritually weak and torn apart by internal division. The reality they saw was a placid, unified, and terrifyingly powerful society. Ilona began to ask herself a dangerous question. It wasn't, when will we be free, but what do we actually fight for? The evidence accumulated, a silent indictment of their old worldview. It was in the numbers, the brute facts they could see and count for themselves. The farm they worked on was 300 acres. Zofia knew that in her village, that much land would have been divided among 30 families. Frank, the farmer, managed it with his one son and his machines. During the harvest, they watched trucks, laden with corn, line up at the grain elevator in the nearby town. Ilona counted 34 trucks in a single morning. She learned later that this small town in Iowa, a place that didn't even appear on most maps, shipped out more grain in a year than her entire home county produced. The numbers were incomprehensible. They read from a discarded newspaper that American factories had produced over 80,000 landing craft for the invasions in Europe and the Pacific. The women had seen the result of those landings, the wreckage, and the cost. But they had never conceived of the industrial leviathan that had produced the tools for it. They had been told it was German technical genius and fighting spirit against overwhelming but incompetent hordes. The evidence before their eyes suggested something different. It was a fight between German craft and American mass production. And mass production had won. The women had access to records of their own labor. Eleanor kept a small notebook, carefully marking down the hours each woman worked. At the end of the week, they were given scrip, a form of camp currency, which they could use to buy small items at a commissary, soap, candy, magazines. The pay was 80 cents a day. The transaction was mundane, bureaucratic. But to Alona, it was another piece of the puzzle. The system was so wealthy, so organized, that it could afford to pay its prisoners. It quantified their labor, converted it to a monetary value, and compensated them for it, all while its own men were fighting and dying overseas. This wasn't the behavior of a nation stretched to its limits. It was the behavior of a nation operating with a vast margin of error, a surplus of everything: food, fuel, money, and even a peculiar, detached form of justice. The evidence was not just in what they saw, but in what they didn't see. They saw no rationing queues, no malnourished children, no women weeping in streets. The war was an abstraction here, a project being managed efficiently at a distance. The only signs of it were the blue stars in the windows of some houses, signifying a son at war, and the occasional war bond poster. For the women of Algona, the war had been a physical reality of hunger, fear, and death. For the people of Algona, it was a collective effort, a patriotic duty, and a source of respectable, distant grief. The psychological cost of this constant dissonance began to mount. It settled in their bodies. Some women grew lethargic, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of their defeat, which they now understood was not just military, but economic and industrial. Others became brittle, prone to sudden flashes of anger over small things: a misplaced tool, a misunderstood instruction. The steady, reliable meals, which should have been a comfort, became a source of profound guilt. Every bite of food was a betrayal of their families, who were, for all they knew, starving in the ruins of Hungary. The nights were the worst. The Iowa landscape, so productive and peaceful by day, became a vast, empty darkness at night. The only sounds were the crickets and the distant whistle of train. There was no curfew siren, no rumble of bombers overhead. The silence was absolute. It left too much room for thought. In the barracks, the women spoke little. They lay on their cots, each trapped in her own internal exile. One evening, Alona watched as Margit, a nurse from Szeged, received a letter from the Red Cross. It was the first news from home in over a year. She read it, her face expressionless. Then she folded it carefully, placed it under her pillow, turned to the wall, and began to shake. Her sobs were silent, a rhythmic trembling of her shoulders in the dim light. No one went to her. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They all knew the letter could only contain a list of the dead and the missing. The grief was private, but the cause was shared. It was the crushing weight of their new knowledge. Their husbands, brothers, and sons had not died for a noble cause against a worthy foe. They had died throwing themselves against an engine of production so vast it could barely be bothered to notice their sacrifice. Later that night, Ilona heard a whisper in Hungarian from the next bunk. Zofia's voice, rough and low. "For what?" she asked the darkness. "All of it." "For what?" There was no answer, only the relentless chirping of the crickets, the sound of a world that had not been broken and did not care. Ilona lay awake, the weight on her chest so heavy she could barely breathe. It was not the sadness of a prisoner. It was the despair of a ghost, haunting a world she could no longer comprehend. The revelation did not arrive in a flash of insight, but as a slow, dawning clarity crystallizing one hot afternoon. Ilona was in the field, her hands raw from pulling tassels from the tops of cornstalks. She paused to wipe sweat from her eyes and looked toward the farmhouse. Frank was working on his red tractor, the engine stalled. His son, a boy of about 16, was handing him tools. They weren't shouting or frantic. They were working with the calm, methodical patience of men who know they have time and resources. Eleanor came out of the house with a pitcher of lemonade, its sides beaded with condensation. She said something to Frank, and he laughed. A real laugh, loud and unburdened. The boy drank a glass of lemonade in 3 long swallows. After a few more minutes, the tractor's engine caught, sputtering to life with a cloud of black smoke before settling into its familiar, confident roar. Frank wiped his hands on a rag, took the last glass of lemonade from his wife, and drank it down. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment before climbing back into the driver's seat. It was a simple domestic scene. A family, a machine, a farm. And in that moment, Ilona understood. The war was not won by tanks, but by tractors. The implications of this simple thought spread through her mind, reordering everything she knew. First, it meant that America's military power was not its primary strength. It was a byproduct, an overflow of its immense productive capacity. The tanks, the planes, the ships, they were just the surplus cream skimmed from the top of an ocean of milk. The real power was in the soil, the factories, the seamless logistics that moved food and goods and men with quiet, relentless efficiency. Second, it meant that the entire ideological foundation of their war was a fraud. They had been told they were fighting for the survival of their culture against a corrupt, weak-willed enemy. But the enemy was not weak. It was so strong that most of its people were not even required to sacrifice. They were asked to buy bonds and save scrap metal, while the farms and factories churn out a victory that was, in material terms, inevitable. The final implication was the most painful. It meant their struggle, their suffering, the destruction of their homes, and the death of their people had been futile from the start. They had not been engaged in a war. They had been participating in an industrial accident. They were the wreckage left behind by a collision with a force they had never even seen, let alone understood. This new understanding connected the smallest details of Ilona's daily life to the grand scale of global conflict. The tractor became more than a machine. It was a symbol of a system. Because American farms were mechanized, the nation could deploy 16 million men in its armed forces and still produce enough food to feed half the world. Because its industrial base was untouched by bombs and supported by a deep well of resources, it could build a Liberty ship in 4 days, an AB-24 bomber every hour, while simultaneously manufacturing refrigerators and nylon stockings. The cause and effect chain was inescapable. The rich soil and clever machines led to agricultural surplus. The surplus fed a healthy, well-supplied population and army. That army, backed by an industrial engine of unimaginable scale, was able to project force across 2 oceans. This system of production tends to create a society where war is experienced as a remote, managed crisis rather than a daily struggle for survival. The consequences of conflict may become abstract, something seen in newsreels rather than felt in an empty stomach. The women in the Iowa camp were living proof of this abstraction. They were the physical embodiment of the enemy, yet they were treated not with hatred, but with a kind of detached utility. They were a problem of labor management, not a target of existential rage. Looking back at the hands of Eleanor, the farm wife, Ilona saw it clearly. They were strong and capable, but they were not the desperate, clawing hands of a woman trying to keep her family from starving. They were the hands of a woman who was a partner in a vast, productive enterprise, a woman who knew, with an unshakable certainty, that there would always be enough. A woman stands at the edge of a field in Iowa, the sound of a roaring engine in her ears. But it is not the sound of a tank. It is the sound of a harvest, the sound of a power so immense it makes armies irrelevant. The women of Algona were eventually repatriated, sent back to a Hungary that was now under Soviet domination, a world of genuine scarcity and fear. What did they take with them? Not memories of cruelty or hardship, but the far more unsettling memory of abundance. The image of a red tractor moving faster than a panzer. The taste of butter. The sight of a closet full of dresses. For Ilona, and for the others, the world was forever divided into 2 realities, the one they had been born into and the one they had glimpsed for a brief, bewildering time in the heart of America. The history of war is often written in the clash of armies. But what changes when we measure power not by the weapons that destroy, but by the machines that provide? Notice, next time you see a piece of heavy machinery, the quiet story it tells about the world it operates in. If this story reframes your understanding of history, subscribe for more explorations into the unseen engines of change. In our next episode, we'll uncover the logistical miracle of the Berlin airlift, through the eyes of the German women who kept the city's records.